Hello, thanks for joining us today. This is Benjamin Scout and Rick Heffelbauer. We're going to be talking about tomatoes today and questions that we commonly get at the USU Extension office here in Washington County. Tomatoes it's probably the number one vegetable that people like to grow, or fruit, I guess is technically a fruit, but people like to grow those in their garden. And it's one of the most fickle ones. It has a lot of every year is a little bit different with tomatoes, so we wanted to go over some of the most common questions that we get here at the Extension office and answer them in this video. So the first one that we had is, what varieties do well in our area for tomatoes?
So my experience in talking to a lot of the growers, the varieties that seem to do well are the ones that can tolerate heat the most. The other ones that do well are the ones that ripen early, so you kind of avoid the heat. So something like Early Girl does pretty well. 4th of July does pretty well because it's a small tomato but ripens fairly early, and it's also pretty tolerant of the heat. Then we get into some other varieties that have been around a while, like Heat Wave is another variety that does good with the high temperatures that we have. 4th of July, another good variety that does well. The problem I think that we get into so much is we can't plant usually before the first week of April because that's about when our first, or I should say our last frost date is about that time. So most people can plant around the first or second week of April, but then about a month later it starts to get pretty hot in May.
It does. So with tomatoes, usually when it gets above 95 degrees, over 100 degrees, tomatoes really kind of shut down. They don't like it very much. They kind of grow into self-preservation mode where they won't grow much. They have a hard time ripening fruit. So finding those ones that are a little bit more suited for heat, and nurseries carry a lot of those around here. The ones that people have had the most success with, they'll carry a lot of those. Another one that comes to mind is a Phoenix. Is another variety that's a little bit heat tolerant, but yeah, those are some good varieties to try. To talk about how do you plant tomatoes, and we get a lot of questions on this. This one's kind of a fun one, so I'll talk about it, and Rick, if you have anything you want to add, feel free to add to it. But tomatoes, I can pull one out. So we have some tomatoes here. There are a bunch that are different sizes. Some are really short, some are pretty tall. So these ones probably should have been planted a while ago. We'll just pop one of those out and probably make a little bit of a mess, but so when you're planting tomatoes, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a bunch of bumps that go along and some hairs that are coming off of it that go along the stem of this tomato plant. So tomatoes, this is unique to tomatoes specifically, there's not any other vegetable that you can do this with, is you can plant them deeper than the root ball. So you can plant this tomato, and if I was planting it, if I had good workable soil, I would probably plant it up to about there. So you can plant them extra deep. What that does, all those little bumps will grow into a root, and you'll have a lot more, instead of just having that root ball as your root source, you'll have all these roots that'll poke out along the stem and grow into a good, strong, healthy root system, which you'll get a more vigorous plant. It'll grow a little bit quicker, and hopefully you can get the tomatoes that you're looking for. So that's my experience with tomatoes. What about spacing? What do you recommend for spacing, right?
So usually if you're going to grow the tomatoes just on the ground, let them vine out on the ground, you want to space them about 3 feet apart. But if you're going to put them up on a trellis, usually about 1.5 to 2 feet distance, because you're going to use the vertical space. The other thing that's kind of interesting about tomatoes, particularly down here, I think a lot of people will trellis because the other thing that it does is it of course keeps the tomato off the ground, which gets usually a little bit better quality tomato. But the other thing is, if you can let the tomato vine up, then it can also give it some shade, because we do get some sunburning on tomato fruits down here. Actually quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, we do. And then there are 2 types of tomatoes as far as their growth habits and patterns. So you'll have a determinate, which they're usually your more bushy tomatoes. They don't vine out quite as much. And then you have indeterminate varieties that are going to vine out all over the place, and those ones are probably some of the better ones to stake and try and you can get off the ground a little bit more. So another question, we get into diseases and some of the funky things that the tomatoes will do, so we wanted to cover that really quick. But how do you prevent diseases in your tomatoes? what are some of the things that we can?
Well, I think one of the things that the pathologists have encouraged us to do over the years is to try not to spray the foliage as much as you can. The main reason there is that if you continuously wet the foliage of the tomato plant, then any fungi, bacteria that might be there will be splashed with the wetting of the foliage, particularly if it's repeatedly done. So that's probably one of the biggest preventative things. The other thing is we were talking earlier about the difference between maybe letting a tomato vine on the ground versus trellising it. I think if you let them vine on the ground, particularly if you don't have like a mulch or some type of synthetic material on the ground, you can make them a little more susceptible to disease that way too.
Yeah, a lot of our diseases that are transferred by insects, they'll land on something that has a disease or a virus that's susceptible, or tomatoes are susceptible to. Tobacco mosaic virus is one of those that'll cause some yellow patterns on the leaves that look kind of cool, but it's something that'll affect them a little bit. But a bug will bite an alfalfa plant if you're next to an alfalfa field that has that disease or virus, and then it'll transfer it to your tomatoes if they land on it. Another one that will, a virus that we get a lot, and this is probably the main question we get when it comes to diseases and viruses, are curly top. Curly top's transferred by a beet leaf hopper. It's a small little bug that really doesn't like tomatoes, but it carries the disease. It lives in a lot of the weeds that we have. It gets kind of moved around by the wind. It'll land on our tomato plant and it'll take a bite out of it. If it happens to be carrying that virus, it'll infect it into the plant, and your plant will show symptoms. It'll start to turn kind of a yellow color. The leaves curl up. The veins are kind of a purplish color. From that point, the plant will stop growing and it'll eventually basically be sick, and it'll eventually die. So, I don't know if there's any other viruses or anything you want to add to them.
Well, yeah, I think you mentioned tobacco mosaic and tomato spotted wilt. Those are two that we get. We used to see tomato speck. There was a disease we had around that was just left black specks. And all of these are, as you mentioned before, somewhat dependent on environment, and then the source. If there's something that can bring or spread some of those diseases, particularly these viruses, like curly top around, usually it's there somewhere, either in the weeds, or sometimes there'll be like a beet leaf hopper that's actually been blown in from a field somewhere else where they've been feeding and maybe picked up the virus and then been blown in during a storm or some of the southern winds that we get, and then they'll arrive here, and then they're in a tomato patch where they can feed on tomatoes and kind of inadvertently just transmit that disease. So yeah, those are probably some of the most common viruses that we see.
And they are a little bit hit and miss too. So some years we'll see influx of some of these viruses or diseases that we'll get, and then other years it'll be a great year for tomatoes, and we'll get a lot of tomatoes. It's kind of hit and miss in our part of the world with some of those bugs.